Robert Mulligan's 1972 film adaptation of Thomas Tryon's The Other might be my favorite horror film. At the beginning, it wasn't intended to be a horror film, more of a gothic drama, perhaps, but when you watch it today, The Other is clearly a horror film, and it scares me like nothing else that's ever made it to the screen. The film captured both the wonders and the dangers of one mysterious summer in the 1930s, told from the point of view of two unknown twin boys who had never been in a movie before and who would never appear in a movie again.
We lived pretty much a normal childhood. You know, we would normally be reminded that, oh, those are the kids in the movie, but for the most part, we were just normal kids like everybody else, and that's kind of the way we wanted it.
Yet the making of The Other is also the story of its two principal creators, the writer, Tom Tryon, and the director, Robert Mulligan, both of whom were known to be nice and consummate professionals on a film set, but in private, both men lived lives of complicated personality, and that is what The Other is all about. In this video essay, you will learn as much as I was able to find out about the great film that they made.
Major heartthrob movie star in the 50s and the 60s. He then left that and turned his talents to writing such wonderful, wonderful bestsellers as The Other. Will you please welcome Mr. Tom Tryon? So what do you do? Where do you write?
Give me a pencil.
Any place?
Any place. Any place where I feel moved to write. I could write on top of a phone pole if I had to.
Born in 1926, Tom Tryon and his two brothers grew up in Wethersfield, Connecticut, in a house which his parents, Arthur and Elizabeth Tryon, built on Walcott Hill Road. His father ran the family clothing business over in Hartford. Back then, Wethersfield was a quiet town where nothing much happened. Tom Tryon recalled, "I remember as a boy the tercentenary pageant, and I was very put out that I didn't get asked to be in it. But it made a big impression on me, all those pilgrims and Pequots running around." According to an article by Jocelyn McClurg, Tryon couldn't wait to get out of Wethersfield. During World War II, Tryon enlisted in the United States Navy and served as a radio man. After his service, he enrolled at Yale, graduating with a degree in fine arts. In the 1977 book Conversations with Writers, Tryon told interviewer Robert Dolan that it was at Yale that he discovered he could write. Through his work as a sign painter at the Cape Playhouse, Tryon fell into an unexpected career as an actor, which led to him performing on Broadway, and then a season of repertory with Jose Ferrer, who had been married to a theater actress named Uta Hagen. Eventually, Tom Tryon was recruited by talent scouts to star in Hollywood television shows and movies. Working for Walt Disney was fun. Working with Otto Preminger was not.
Pray for me, that I may not falter, and for the liberty and exaltation of our church and our beloved country. God bless you.
I'm a survivor. I have survived other debacles, but the worst in my life was Otto Preminger.
You work with Otto Preminger, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we have to do a commercial. Just do a little Otto Preminger yelling at you.
Where he would come up behind you and he would say, "Relax!"
Now do Otto Preminger saying, "We'll be right back after
We'll
these
be
messages."
right back after these
Do it
messages.
mean. Do it mean.
We'll be right back after these messages.
After being forced to work for Preminger again on In Harm's Way, Tryon broke his contract with Preminger, but spent the remainder of the 1960s trapped in an acting career which gave him no satisfaction. The year 1966 saw the death of his ex-wife, Broadway production assistant Ann Noyes. Tryon would later state in a People magazine interview that Noyes had killed herself. What the public did not know about Tom Tryon was that in private he was a closeted homosexual. Plus he was descending into a drug and alcohol addiction. Looking back on this period, Tryon recalled, "I was unemployed, unhappy, living alone in a Bel Air mansion complete with swimming pool, Lincoln Continental, servants, gardener, and no food in the refrigerator. My job, money, and credit had all run out." At some point, Tryon considered switching to a career as a director. According to Tryon's lover, Clive Clerk, somebody suggested to Tryon that he write a book, make it into a movie, and direct it himself. Finally, a new idea for a book came to him. Tryon remembered, it started out to be that awful book that everybody writes about a little boy growing up in a small Connecticut town. Everybody's written that book. There was only one child and a much more important relationship with his mother. It was not terribly autobiographical, but I suppose it was close enough. It wasn't until I invented the other brother that it started to happen. Tryon set the story in a place in New England which he called Pequot Landing. When Tryon's younger brother, Bill, read the book, Bill recognized just about all of the characters, claiming that the characters of Niles and Holland were based on Tom and on their older brother, Lane, and that the cousin character of Russell Perry was based on one of their real-life cousins. Tom Tryon would begin the book with a dedication to his and his brother's parents, stating, "For my mother and father." Tryon rewrote the book 9 times and finally sold it in May of 1970. Tryon retained his book's film rights with a business partner named Ed Dukoff. In May 1971, Tryon's new book was finally published under the title The Other. Robert Gottlieb predicted that the book would be a success, and he was correct. Part of the reason why The Other became successful was because it came out at just the right time for the horror genre. I asked First Blood author David Morrell for his comments about this, and Morrell comments, "As I understand the history of modern horror, first there was Richard Matheson, Jack Finney, and Robert Bloch in the 1950s. Then came Ira Levin, William Peter Blatty, and Tom Tryon in the 1960s and 1970s. Now Tom Tryon could realize his dream of seeing his book get turned into a movie. The Daily Variety announced that Tryon and Ed Dukoff had joined forces with Hollywood director Robert Mulligan to produce the film. But had Tom Tryon partnered up with the right filmmaker? Robert Mulligan was best known in the industry for directing sensitive dramas. Why did he want to direct The Other?
Mr. Mulligan, it's really a pleasure to get to meet you. To Kill a Mockingbird has always been, when I have list my top 10 films of all time, that's one of them. So it's nice to meet you and say thank you for Mockingbird.
Thank you. When I list my top 10, that's Mockingbird too. I love that picture.
Born in 1925, Robert Mulligan grew up in the Bronx section of New York City. His brothers included Richard Mulligan, who would grow up to be a famous character actor. In an interview with Joe Smith, Mulligan recalled that when he was 13, he kept a diary in which he wrote short stories and said, "I never told anybody about it, showed anybody, not from the world I came from. Well, maybe I showed it to my mother, but my father never got past grammar school, my mother never graduated high school." When he entered theological school at age 17, he realized that he would make a very bad priest because, in his words, "I was too attracted to women." But Mulligan also admitted that he'd become sensitive to the so-called central myth of Christianity, the crucifixion, which he now referred to as a bloody Gothic act par excellence, the bloodbath represented by the lives of saints and martyrs, which had once fascinated him as a child, but which no longer much interested him as a grown man. During World War II, Mulligan served in the United States Marine Corps as a radio operator. At the end of the war, according to Margaret Fox, Mulligan earned a bachelor's degree from Fordham University, then got a job as a messenger with CBS. In a podcast interview with Adam Long, Summer of 42 author Herman Raucher mentioned how he'd heard that Mulligan was sweeping the floor one day when someone offered Mulligan a job as a director of episodic television. By age 29, Mulligan was directing his first feature film, Fear Strikes Out. Produced by Alan J. Pakula, Fear Strikes Out presented a theme which would someday be prominent in a small handful of Mulligan's films, the issue of mental illness, and the inability of an elder to contain the insanity of a younger person who's losing his mind.
You're killing me.
Oh, I'm trying to help you, Jim.
No, you're not.
In 1962, he reunited with Alan J. Pakula on their phenomenally successful adaptation of Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, in which Mulligan presented audiences with a multitude of parental figures. Parents like Atticus Finch, who were always there for their children. Parents like Bob Ewell, destroyed by alcoholism. Parents like Tom Robinson, torn away from their children by injustice. Parents like Mr. Radley, burdened with a mentally ill son.
Miss Jean Louise, Mr. Arthur Radley. I believe he already knows you.
To Kill a Mockingbird netted Robert Mulligan an Academy Award nomination for Best Director. Because of his gentlemanly nature in public, people may have begun to assume that Mulligan himself was a little like Atticus Finch. However, although Mulligan had children of his own, he did not have a close Atticus Finch-type relationship with them. On a film set, he was usually a nice man. But Mulligan was also an alcoholic, and when Mulligan drank, he was known to become a different person, brittle and mean. Mulligan was also known to clash with studio executives. Once in the 1960s, while directing a film for Warner Brothers, Mulligan used up a lot of film while having to direct himself out of a difficult scene. Afterwards, Mulligan was summoned to a meeting at the studio, and he got yelled at by Jack Warner for using up too much film. Mulligan's Bronx-Irish temper flared up, and a legend arose that he picked up a chair and threw it at Jack Warner, and that the chair supposedly went out the window and crashed on the street outside. Decades later, producer Bill Borden asked Mulligan if the story was true. Mulligan confirmed that he'd thrown a chair at Jack Warner, but he denied that the chair went out the window. In 1968, Mulligan directed his first full-length suspense thriller with The Stalking Moon, which would be his last collaboration with producer Alan J. Pakula. It was a Hitchcockian western, relying less on dialogue and more on the visual threat of a villain who attacked from the shadows, darting in and out of the line of sight of the camera, rarely ever seen. Stop! In 1971, Mulligan directed Summer of 42, a box office smash. Whisking audiences away to a dreamlike Nantucket Island, which existed only in distant memory, Mulligan's perfectionism on Summer of 42 extended right down to the film's voiceover narration.
Life is made up of small comings and goings. And for everything we take with us, there is something that we leave behind.
I believe it was on Summer of 42 that Mulligan broke free of the journeyman mold and emerged as one of Hollywood's most exciting directors. He may have been a native of the Bronx, but when it came to directing the rural nostalgic period piece, nobody was better than him.
And in a very special way, I lost Hermie forever.
Now in his late 40s, Mulligan appeared to be in a position to direct whatever he wanted for the Hollywood studio system. In an interview with Gerard Leaney, Mulligan revealed, "When I started out in television, I produced a long weekly series called Suspense, a bit like Hitchcock. Since then, I have been looking for a story that has a very strong impact. Not necessarily with children. I didn't know Tom Tryon, but a mutual friend told me about his book. He then sent it to me. I met Tryon, and we decided to make the movie right away." Mulligan would also be making his official producing debut on The Other. Asked if he liked being in charge of his own production, he answered, "By far. I've always felt, even in my partnership with Alan Pakula, that we literally co-produced, that we were working in a creative partnership. I've always felt I had total control of the film creatively. I'm not one of those directors who can point to the Philistines in shock and horror and say, 'Look what they did to my film,' because it never really happened. I have to take total responsibility for my films from beginning to end, down the line."
saw Lady Rowe. Come on.
Chris and Marty Udvarnoky were two twin boys living in New Jersey in the early 1970s. Their father was an actor, an opera singer, and a professional violinist. Chris and Marty had done some modeling, but weren't pursuing acting at all.
There was an article apparently in the paper that my old second grade teacher had seen, and she passed it on to my parents, and it was basically asking for inexperienced twins for the movie. And so they just took some regular photographs of us and sent it along, and lo and behold, there was a phone call, and I didn't know anything about what was happening. There was a phone call, and I answered it. Now I'm 10 years old, and they're talking about something about, an interview for a movie, and I was rather confused. So I had my dad on the phone, and he straightened everything out. So we were scheduled to go to New York City, this posh, hotel on the east side. And we go up to this suite, I guess it would have been, and there's wall-to-wall twins, a lot of twins being interviewed. I remember there was a set of triplets as well. So it's our turn to be interviewed. We go into the room, and I can't remember exactly who was there. There was probably about a panel of 3 or 4 people. I think Thomas Tryon might have been one of them. So they just, they asked us just questions about our everyday life. And so we left, not thinking too much of it. Lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, they called us to come in for another interview. And this time, the number of twins were narrowed down. And it was basically the same thing. We sat in front of a panel of some different people. I wish I remembered who they were. And we were asked pretty much the same questions. Went home and thought our chances were a little better, I guess. And then they called again and asked us to come back in New York City and do what they were calling a screen test. And they had it narrowed down to 3 sets of twins. And mind you, they were doing the exact same thing on California, on the West Coast. There wasn't any, request to act anything out or read any lines, which I thought was kind of strange. And then we got the call a couple of weeks after that saying we got the part. And I remember my father saying that someone came up to him and said, your twins are the exact person that we're looking for. And we kind of resemble, if you see the book, there's a profile of one of the twins, and we kind of resemble that.
The Udvarnoky twins weren't yet familiar with Robert Mulligan's previous work. They had heard of To Kill a Mockingbird, but hadn't seen it yet, so their parents took them to see Summer of 42. Eventually, the boys were flown out to Los Angeles to begin rehearsals with Robert Mulligan on the 20th Century Fox lot in Century City.
We would meet in Robert Mulligan's office, and we would just go over the lines together. And he wanted to know who would want to play Niles and who would want to play Holland. And for some reason, I said I wanted to play Holland, I guess because, the evil one. And my brother said he wanted to be Niles. And when we told Robert Mulligan that, he kind of agreed. He said that was kind of what I was thinking as well. Yeah. So that was pretty cool. Yeah, so I guess, we did this on a daily basis for about a month until it was time to go to Murphy's, California for the actual shooting of the movie.
You miss Russia, don't you?
Sometimes. But God does not mean that we should miss too much what He takes from us.
Since Tom Tryon was now the film's executive producer, this gave him a certain measure of control over the casting. For the part of Niles and Holland's mysterious Russian grandmother, Ada, Tryon wanted Uta Hagen, who was German-American. According to Uta Hagen's daughter, Lady Ferrer, her mother was very good friends with Tryon. During visits to California, she would sometimes stay at Tryon's house in the hills. When Tryon sent Hagen a copy of The Other, she read it and fell in love with it. Hagen had never been in a film before. She wasn't keen on the cinema. Her world was the theater. She said it was because she didn't feel movies gave her enough freedom as an actress, but actually, decades earlier, Hagen and Jose Ferrer had once been asked to do a Hollywood film together. They'd driven out to California only for the idea to be decided against, so Hagen and Ferrer went back east. According to their daughter, the blacklisting was all due to their association with Paul Robeson. Asked by Terry Curtis Fox how Uta Hagen got cast in The Other, Mulligan replied, "There was just no other choice. She was the first name mentioned and the only one we pursued. I had never met Uta. I sent her the script and she responded in less than a day. I was in New York at the time and I jumped on a seaplane because she lives in Montauk and lives a very quiet life." Hagen would later confide to actress Diana Muldaur that had Mulligan not gone all the way to Montauk to talk her into it, she never would have agreed to be in the film. However, C. Robert Holloway states that the casting of Hagen was something which Tom Tryon and his lover, longtime companion and uncredited literary editor Clive Clerk had insisted upon, and that they had to beat up on Mulligan about it.
Mother! Mother! Niles.
Diana Muldaur recalls that she got cast in the part of the boy's reclusive mother, Alexandra, because Tom Tryon was a huge fan of her work. Tryon once told Muldaur, "You should be a great star," and he also said that she reminded him of his real mother, Elizabeth. Muldaur comments, "Tom did the whole thing," adding, "The beauty of the film was the balance between the family and the horror. The stronger the family, the worse the horror." She thought that Tryon's screenplay was beautifully balanced in its portrait of the Perry family, and that the part of Alexandra was fascinating. It would also give Muldaur a chance to finally work with Uta Hagen. Years earlier, Muldaur had auditioned for Hagen and was accepted into her acting classes, yet Muldaur became unable to attend the first class because she was performing in a play that day at Circle in the Square. She had called Hagen on the phone, suggesting that she have a friend fill in for her to take notes, but Hagen responded that Muldaur was required to attend the first class herself, or else she wouldn't understand the lessons, meaning that Muldaur would have to drop out. Now Muldaur and Hagen were crossing paths again, in a big way this time. Muldaur isn't sure whether Hagen remembered her, but comments that it was a joy for her to now be playing Hagen's daughter in a film.
And you said to me, "Mother, what did you do in the Civil War?"
Are you hoping?
Yes, darling, I'm hoping.
Everything is going to be all right now.
Everything's going to be all right.
What's playing at the movies?
Bet we saw it.
I'll bet we didn't.
We saw it. Naughty Marietta and Murder in the Blue Room.
Cast in the role of Niles and Holland's brother-in-law, Ritter, John Ritter was the son of country singer Tex Ritter and actress Dorothy Fay. Ritter had done a small amount of film and television work, but was not yet a big star.
Oh, honey, bring home some sarsaparilla. I have a craving.
God, pregnant women.
Cast in the role of Niles and Holland's sister, Torrie, actress Jenny Sullivan was the daughter of actor Barry Sullivan and actress Marie Brown.
My very dear friend, John Ritter, and I had the same agent. And I don't know if I went in before he did or whatever it was, but I do remember that sort of being, kind of a cool thing that we got to do that together. And so, yeah, I went on an audition for Robert Mulligan. What was it, Summer 42 was his, that movie just slayed me. So, one of the kindest human beings on the planet. You could just feel that with him.
In 2018, I spoke on the phone with assistant director and associate producer Don Kranze. Our conversation was brief, but Kranze told me that he first met Robert Mulligan in New York in the early 1960s during screen tests for To Kill a Mockingbird. Kranze didn't work on Mockingbird, but he later got jobs working as an assistant director for Mulligan on Up the Down Staircase and The Stalking Moon, before graduating to assistant director and associate producer on Summer of 42. When I asked Kranze how he felt about then getting to work with Mulligan on a horror film, Kranze answered that The Other wasn't really a horror film, indicating to me that the filmmakers had tried to distance themselves from that genre. I asked Kranze how he got an associate producer credit on The Other. Kranze claimed to me that his associate producer credit was meaningless, But when I asked him how he first got involved in the production, Kranze told me that he read the book and that the first thing Mulligan told him to do was find a house to shoot the film's exteriors. Kranze had remembered seeing the 1947 movie The Red House, filmed in the town of Murphys in Northern California, and the locations in that movie made such an impression on Kranze that he persuaded Mulligan to film The Other in Murphys, using the same town and the same house. Homeowner Judith Marvin informs me that the house was built in 1897 by Ethel Willard Adams, a descendant of the presidential Adams family. The house was originally just natural redwood on the exterior, with bull's blood trim, but it would be painted white for The Other. A staircase was built in the yard, but taken down after the film was completed. I believe that the statue which you see here in the yard is standing where the well in the film used to be. The production designer on The Other would be Academy Award nominee Albert Brenner, who had previously worked for Mulligan on Summer of '42. Brenner states that on The Other, Mulligan wanted a New England look with farmland and a huge barn, so a barn was built nearby. Brenner states that someone even wanted to buy the barn after filming was completed, but of course the barn wasn't built to code. To shoot The Other, Mulligan hired Academy Award-winning cinematographer Robert Surtees, who, like Brenner, had also worked on Summer of '42. Mulligan's wife, Sandy, comments, Robert Surtees had done Summer of '42 with Bob and was delighted he could come on board. Don Kranze told me that Mulligan had never wanted to make the movie in New England. However, according to casting associate Jim Riggs, they had talked about New England, but decided on Northern California because it was more advantageous. C. Robert Holloway states that Tom Tryon wasn't happy with this, or with the film's skimpy low budget, which Jim Riggs states came down to $3.5 million. According to Don Kranze, Tom Tryon also did not approve of Mulligan's decision to cast actor Lou Frizzell in the role of Uncle George.
Hi, Uncle George.
What say, Skipper? Great day for the race, isn't it?
What race?
The human race.
The character is supposed to be from New England, and Tom Tryon did not like Frizzell's southern accent. To cast the role of Niles and Holland's cousin, Russell Perry, Mulligan decided to cast a non-actor, a local boy who was already living in Murphys. Clarence Crow says that he was born in Fresno, California. He was not born in Murphys, as his IMDb biography falsely claims, but Crow had moved to Murphys during a brief period of his childhood. Murphys had a swimming pool near the center of town, and it was there that Crow first met Chris and Marty Udvarnoky, who told him that they weren't from there. They were there to make a movie. Crow asked the twins, "Gee, could I be in your movie?" But apparently all the parts had already been cast. Later that fall, however, Crow was walking home from school when Robert Mulligan rode up nearby in a limousine. Crow says that maybe Tom Tryon was even in the limo as well. As Crow puts it, Mulligan and Tryon instantly thought, that's it, that's Russell Perry. As for what happened next, Crow comments, they did a U-turn, got pulled over by the sheriff, got a ticket, and I got away. The next day, Mulligan and Tryon noticed Crow walking the same route. They waved at him, told him who they were associated with, and asked Crow if he wanted to be in the movie. Crow replied that he wasn't supposed to talk to strangers and declined their offer to give him a ride. Crow was living with his grandparents at the time in a cabin protected by 2 gates. When Crow returned home, the limo driver got out, opened the first gate, then the second gate, and followed Crow all the way to his grandparents' cabin near the creek. Crow's grandparents said they'd think about letting their grandson be in the film. Thus began what Crow describes as one of the happiest times in his life. Mulligan said that he wanted to keep Niles Perry's point of view in the film subjectively and emotionally constant, explaining, Once I felt that could be done, all the pans would have to be from one boy to another, but I could never pan back. Also, what was clear, obviously clear, is that I could never put both boys in the same shot at the same time because I would be lying to an audience.
For the most part, he was nice and he was very directive. He knew exactly what he was looking for, and so he wanted us to follow his direction to the T. And I can remember one particular scene, and it was during the winter time. Now it's California, so it's not like, snow winter, but it's very cold, and we were just dressed in these bathing suits that were high up, and the polo shirt, and we were freezing. And I remember we just couldn't get it straight, and that was the first time I think I ever saw him get a little angry, because he had to keep doing retakes and retakes and retakes, and of course we had other scenes that we had to shoot that day, so we're kind of out of schedule because of that.
Mulligan's wife, Sandy, recalls, "My husband enjoyed working with both Chris and Martin Udvarnoky. They were bright, sweet young boys, and talented." The other would be shot in the 1:85:1 aspect ratio. Asked how he worked with his cinematographer, Mulligan answered, "What's up on the screen in terms of where that camera is, who it's seeing, and what it's doing, the staging and all is all mine. The texture of light and the use of light, if I'm using filters or whatever, comes out of a discussion with Bob Surtees. The enormous contribution that Surtees makes, I want him around all the time, that's all I can say, is that he understands what I want, the mood and the texture of the world that I want, that I can't do. I can put a camera there, but if that man isn't really into my head, knowing the mood and style I want, if he's not painting with light, I'm dead." Marty Udvarnoky comments that acting with his twin brother Chris was not that surreal, and that filming in Murphy's was quaint and more enjoyable than filming on a studio lot. Murphy's local Marcia Sanders says that her family rented out an old push-button automatic Mercury Comet to the mother of the twins. Marcia Sanders owns several rats that were used in the film, and recalls that she had to find rats that would look as close to wild rats as possible, then train them with soundless hand signals to come off screen. The rats needed to run over to a busted jar of pickle, but since rats don't like pickle, Sanders hid a few green Fruit Loops in the pickle to attract them. One of Sanders' old white rats, named Sherwood, passed away, but the company asked Sanders to save Sherwood's body because they needed a dead rat too. Sanders even got paid for letting Sherwood's body be in the film. Mulligan stated, "Part of what intrigued me about Tom's book was his ability to evoke that period in specifics. I could begin smelling the kitchen, tasting the food, the look of a radio, the pattern of a rug, all of that. What we did was to set out to literally recreate Tom's memory of what his home looked like." Editor Nicholas Brown remembers that the clock which was used for the film was important to Tom Tryon. An unofficial consultant who worked on the film named Arthur Riley, whom Brown says was one of Tryon's lovers and went around for Tryon helping on certain things, once told Brown, "That clock is Tom's clock," leading Brown to wonder in bewilderment if certain lurid things in the story had really occurred in Tryon's life. Brown wittily comments, "Tom Tryon scared the shit out of me."
I can especially remember John Ritter because he was just a funny guy, like all day long. And he was kind of like our, even though it was a big age difference, he was kind of like a best friend of ours on the set. So I guess he kind of like lowered himself to our level of humor, and he was hilarious.
Playing husband and wife was easy for John Ritter and Jenny Sullivan as they had worked together before.
We had already been doing improvs with each other and doing crazy stuff in acting class together. And we had done Dan August. And after that, we did theater together, and we even did a rock video for Graham Nash as a couple. I went to a couple of his weddings, things like that.
Jenny Sullivan's then husband was rock star Jim Messina, and being on location in Murphy's, California even gave Messina some inspiration for the new album that he was working on with Kenny Loggins.
Jimmy was rehearsing with Kenny at my dad's house and creating the Sittin' In album. And then I got this movie, and he came up to visit, and he thought, wow, wouldn't this be cool to actually shoot the album cover here? And he came up, the whole band came up, and the wardrobe department helped, with wardrobe, but we got to use the old cars. The whole synchronicity of everything was pretty incredible.
There's one of my sunshine boys now.
Hi, Aunt V.
The character of Aunt V would be played by actress Norma Connolly, whose son, Adam Rodman, did not visit the set, but recalls that the first day of production coincided with his sister's first day at a new school, and his sister was not thrilled to have their mom AWOL. Rodman states that his mother brought back from Murphy's some frog figurines as an homage to Mark Twain's Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Clarence Crow says that working with Chris Udvarnoky was basically fun and that he found Chris to be rather amusing. He remembers that Chris often got his lines wrong because Chris often had to run while yelling his lines at the same time. When the children weren't working, they were tutored by Betty Wickland, the wife of Hollywood studio teacher Richard Wickland. Sometimes when Crow was hesitant to do something, Mulligan told him he'd give him $1 if he did it. One time when Crow did something, Tom Tryon told Crow to hold his fingers up to get the cash from Mulligan, something which Tryon and Mulligan both thought was hilarious. Mulligan also wanted Crow to gain weight, and would encourage Crow to eat donuts supplied at the set catering table. In the barn sequence, Crow didn't want to jump down into the hay, so a stuntman proved to him that it was safe. Crow even made the crew search the hay to make sure there was no pitchfork. Mulligan told Crow that if he performed the stunt at least once, he'd give each of the 3 boys a yo-yo. Crow performed the stunt once, but then Mulligan said he needed Crow to do it one more time, so Crow got 2 yo-yos for the price of 1. Crow says that he also got to attend his own funeral, and that he was in the background up in the church during the filming, but he doesn't appear in the final edit of the sequence. The house exteriors for the other would be shot in Murphy's, but the Fairground sequences were shot in the nearby town of Angels Camp.
They had a bunch of really cool rides, and all the extras got to ride on it all day long. And we had asked whoever was in charge, can we get a chance to ride it, at the end of the day? And they said, sure. And before I knew it, I'm looking around, all the carnival rides being taken down. So yeah, I was a little upset about that.
Oh, damn!
For certain sections, the film was going to need tons of extras, so someone from the studio asked a local rental agent named Jim Riggs, as well as his wife Joanne, to be the film's casting directors. The Riggses would end up working on the production for 13 weeks. They cast the majority of the extras by running an ad in the paper and photographing between 200 and 300 people. The Riggses were not involved in the casting of the obese woman who came from a circus, or the casting of the man with the disfigured face, whom Jim Riggs recalls had a sense of humor. Joanne Riggs even made a cameo as the gum-chewing assistant of the false Chinese magician Chan Yu, something which her family teased her about. Chan Yu would be played by Hollywood character actor Ed Bakey.
Working with Portia was just a treat, and she allowed me to act, as if I was actually scaring her with the with the rat. Yeah. So I just remember it being fun.
During the Main Street sequence where Niles siphons off ice from an ice truck, Jim Riggs says that his real children appear as extras. His daughter, Karen, reveals that she's the one in the light apricot-colored dress. Karen's brother, James Tollefson, also worked on the set, but his appearance was left on the cutting room floor. Asked what it was like working with Uta Hagen, Robert Mulligan answered, "With Uta, a joy. She's a superb actress and a total professional. She's thinking and active and digging into the character, prepared, and bringing surprises. She's a thoughtful, mature, intelligent actress. Mulligan's wife, Sandy, confirms that her husband thought Uta Hagen was wonderful as Ada.
Our first day of shooting, we were shooting the funeral of the neighbor. And it's like, okay, and that's the first time I heard Uta go, meaningful look number 2 or whatever. We're like, and John and I are like, oh my God, we're acting with Uta Hagen,
One night, Uta Hagen invited John Ritter, Jenny Sullivan, and Lou Frizzell to her cabin in the mountains for dinner and a sleepover. While a roast was cooking in the oven, Hagen was then called in to work, giving Ritter the idea to pull a prank on her.
We short-sheeted her bed. And the next day, we were like, oh God, let's see what, she didn't say a word about it.
Years later, Jenny Sullivan ran into Uta Hagen at an opening night in New York, giving Hagen the opportunity for a comeback.
She had a table of family and friends, admirers, and she's smoking away. And she just announces to the entire table, this woman short-sheeted my bed. It was very funny. I got in a cab and called John right away. I said, oh my God.
And when I came here and found this church, this angel became for me the angel of the brighter day, you see.
Letty Ferrer recalls that Hagen loved the way Mulligan worked with the Udvarnoky twins.
Just before I died, the angel would swoop down and take me in her wings, carry me off to heaven. That's what Ada says.
How do you know she wouldn't take you to hell?
Angels don't go to hell. Only bad people do.
Diana Muldaur didn't get as much direction from Mulligan. From her perspective, he was quiet and kept to himself. Muldaur recalls that she and the rest of the cast were required to attend the dailies, which were shown at Angel's Camp. At the dailies, Mulligan didn't want to hear the cast's opinions. He simply wanted them to be able to see their performances. Since Jim Riggs happened to be a pilot, he was additionally hired to fly the dailies over to Sacramento, where they were then sent off to the 20th Century Fox lot in Century City. Riggs remembers that Tom Tryon was somewhat critical of how the film was being made, since Tryon wanted it to be more like the book, yet Mulligan tended to change things. Tryon's close friend, C. Robert Holloway, heard that Tryon and Mulligan did not get along. For the scene where Alexandra falls down the stairs, Diana Muldaur states that the production had hired a wonderful young stunt woman who had to sit on her hands until midnight. Muldaur thought it was disgraceful that the stunt woman had to sit around all day long. Years later, when Muldaur got on the SAG board, she insisted on better rules to protect stunt performers.
Where was Holland when he gave you the ring? We were in a front parlor. Did he give you this too? Yes, I gave it to him. I'll give it back, Mother.
During filming, Muldaur stayed in a cabin in the town of Arnold, right above Murphy's, and she discovered a place some miles away called Bear Valley. Years later, Muldaur's second husband, Robert Dozier, whose screenwriting credits included The Cardinal, had wanted to get away from Los Angeles, so together they got a place in Bear Valley, and Muldaur comments that she never would have known about that area without her experience working on the other. Adam Rodman recalls that he used to play with Robert Dozier's kids. In the scene where Ada takes Niles to the grave and demands that he play the game to see what's buried in the ground below, Tom Tryon's script indicates that we were supposed to go down underground into a coffin and see a corpse with devoured eyes, lips pulled back from bare teeth, and a magician's grin. In fact, the shooting schedule proves that the company had a prop skull and mildew effects ready for the scene, leading me to speculate that this coverage was shot but wasn't used in the final edit. I think it would have been awesome to see.
Holland! Holland!
true, now, out loud so we shall both hear it. Holland is dead. Remember, on his birthday. He is dead, Niles. Remember. Remember.
For Holland's death scene, Jim Riggs recalls that he found a lady in town who had 2 young cats which were used. Don Kranze said, "Don't alter the cats," but Riggs cut the cat's nails anyway. During filming, Kranze would say lights, camera, action, and then the cat would go berserk in Marty Udvarnoky's arms.
The above ground well was just a well that was probably about 5 or 6 feet deep. When I went over the edge, there was somebody, it was like one of the prop guys that were he was down there catching me. And so, that was obviously no big deal. They had a little crawl space at the bottom. So they were filming at the top of the building, shooting down, and I got into the crawl space and was at the bottom of the well, just looking a little mangled, and of course with the makeup on. And so I was above ground pretty, the whole time.
Yeah.
So
what was it like having to deal with that cat and you're struggling in your arms?
I don't remember anything disturbing about it.
Yeah.
I'm an animal lover, so I'm sure it didn't
scratch or anything, did
No, I don't remember it scratching me, and I probably felt bad about treating it the way I did. But I, now that you say that, I do remember the guy that was down there to catch me was actually the cat actually went to the bathroom on him. As it was being thrown down. So
the part of the Perry family's hired hand, Leno Angelini, would be played by character actor Victor French.
I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry.
It's all right, Mr. Angelini. It wasn't your fault. It was an accident.
Prior to the other, French was known in Hollywood for playing heavies, especially in westerns such as the television show Gunsmoke and Howard Hawks' final film, Rio Lobo. One time, French even took a swing at John Wayne for talking smack. French was also a dedicated award-winning acting coach and the president and artistic director of the Company of Angels Theater in Los Angeles. I spoke with French's daughter, Lee Tracy Hall, and she informs me that her father believes seriously that acting is a profession which takes a lifetime to master. In his words, you have to be willing, as with any art, to treat it as your religion. If you want to make it, you have to be willing to put up with a lot of shit, and don't let anyone fuck with your craft. French's agent, Doug Cooper, didn't have many clients, and Cooper was the one who got French the part of Mr. Angelini. Don Kranze comments that he might have even recommended French for the part. French would be cast against type in the other, not as a heavy this time, but as an innocent, sensitive man who was ultimately punished for having the appearance of a heavy. French's family accompanied him in Murphy's and Angel's camp during filming. They stayed at a bed and breakfast called Mama Bluett's, and as Lee Tracy Hall recalls, they would go looking for rocks with him in the countryside when he wasn't working on the set. The surviving cast of the other has nothing but fond memories of Victor French.
I remember Victor French being extremely funny, also doing a lot of different impersonations and things like that.
We were there for a long time, and a lot of time we were out in the fields with Victor French hunting rocks and breaking them open and seeing what we found inside.
Clarence Crow remembers that French would perform magic tricks, producing coins from behind his ear. French may have had a sense of humor on the set, but the part of Mr. Angelini would require the actor to go to levels of deep sadness, even rage. Nothing that happens in the other is Mr. Angelini's fault, but he doesn't know that. Racked with guilt and torment, believing himself to be dangerously incompetent, Mr. Angelini is driven to private moments of intense drunkenness, smashing up a cask with a mallet, soaked in alcohol, and in his own tears. Victor French's father, Ted French, had been a Hollywood stuntman, and Lee Tracy Hall observes that young Vic would have grown up witnessing the alcoholism which ran rampant throughout the world of Hollywood stunts in the 1940s. It's possible that Victor French may have been drawing upon those personal memories in order to become Mr. Angelini.
I'm a sorry boy. Leno, he's broke. Leno fix. Leno fix.
Mulligan and Victor French became friends during and after the film's production. French's then wife, Judith Shend, would invite Mulligan over to their house for barbecues, and Mulligan later cast French as the bartender Patty in his follow-up film, The Nickel Ride, although French was disappointed when many of his scenes in that film got left on the cutting room floor. French still gives a very good performance in The Nickel Ride, but the extent of his range as an actor is more clearly on display in The Other. Mr. Angelini is the scapegoat in The Other, blamed for Russell Perry's death by pitchfork in the barn, treated cruelly by certain members of the Perry family simply because he looks different, and finally seized by a vengeful mob after the disappearance and death of Ritter and Torrie's baby daughter. When you hear one member of the mob screaming at him, "You're gonna get the chair for this, you bastard," while another mob member sneers, "Chair's too good for him," it's unbearably harrowing. I always get reminded of Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird, another innocent man whose life is destroyed by someone else's evil doings. Reflecting on her father's experience playing Mr. Angelini in The Other, Lee Tracy Hall concludes, "I know it was very rewarding for him. He was playing a character that was troubled, and the scenes were well written, and he shined." When the baby disappears, the scene in which Niles spies on a panicking Torrie proved to be a challenging acting exercise for Jenny Sullivan.
I remember the night before shooting, I was like, I was just terrified because I thought, oh boy, I hope I can do this. And like any really great acting exercise, all you have to do is put yourself in the environment and take the emotional content of what you're going through, and there it was, and I was relieved and pleased that I was able to do that.
The grisly nature of the baby's whereabouts required Lou Frizzell to switch Uncle George's chipper nature into a state of trauma, but the scene is heightened by the reaction of the character of Winnie, played by actress Loretta Leversey, who had previously played a social studies teacher in Mulligan's adaptation of Up the Down Staircase, and let loose a blood-curdling scream which gives me shivers every time.
My God,
George, what is it? George, what is it? George, what is it? What happened? Oh, my God, no!
Oh, Jesus.
When Ada finally attempts to immolate Niles, he mistakes her for his prophesied angel of the brighter day. Instead, by casting herself into the fires of the barn, Ada transforms into something which Niles once thought to be impossible, an angel in hell. Marty Udvarnoky observes that when the flames come up, you can hear the apple door shut loudly, suggesting that Niles escaped, something which is indicated further once we see the detached lock lying in the ruins of the barn. I asked Marty if it's him or if it's Chris who appears in the final shot in the window. Marty says that it's Chris. As in the book, Niles survives. As a thank you for their contributions to the production, Robert Mulligan wrote a poem for Chris and Marty Udvarnoky. and Tom Tryon autographed copies of his book for Chris and Marty and for Jenny Sullivan. The shooting schedule indicates that the martini shot would have been the coverage of the weather vane rotating under the force of wind, slotted to be filmed sometime in November of 1971. After that, production wrapped and returned to Los Angeles. But how would the film come together? To edit The Other, Robert Mulligan brought in Academy Award nominee Folmar Blangsted, with whom he had previously worked on Up the Down Staircase, The Pursuit of Happiness, and Summer of '42. Brought in as an assistant editor was Nicholas Brown, who had previously worked as an assistant editor on The Stalking Moon. At first, Brown's job on The Other was to sit in on the dailies, where he wasn't allowed to talk. He had to silently take notes for Folmar Blangsted, whom he remembers as one of the old-timers. At the dailies, the bar was typically open, and Mulligan's choice of drink was gin. Halfway through production on The Other, Folmar Blangsted was requested to go to Spain to edit the film Man of La Mancha. Blangsted told Nicholas Brown, "I'd like to do that movie," and Brown replied, "If you want to do it, but tell Mulligan to move me up." To prove to Mulligan that he was up for the task of taking over as the main editor on The Other, Brown cut together the sequence in which Ada and Niles play the game on a crow as it flies over the Perry farm. Based on the work in this sequence, Mulligan promoted Brown to editor and released Blangsted from the production. Brown also got to be present for the dubbing of the sound mix, where one of the questions raised was, what noises should come out of the Prince Albert can, because nobody knew what the hell the object should sound like. Scoring the music for The Other would be Jerry Goldsmith, who had worked with Mulligan in television during the 1950s, and whose last collaboration with Mulligan had been on 1962's The Spiral Road. The early 1970s was a tumultuous time for Goldsmith. Author Jeff Bond points out that since The Other was a 20th Century Fox film, any decisions about the music at the time would have been overseen by Lionel Newman, who ran the Fox music department and often conducted Goldsmith's scores for the studio. Certain sections of Goldsmith's score would end up getting taken out of the film, along with several whole scenes which had been shot. Nicholas Brown comments that the film's deleted scenes would have been sent to Pacific Title Archives in Kansas City, where the production had sent the trims. Years later, Jerry Goldsmith headed a seminar through the UCLA Extension program, going through clips of selected items throughout his career. Film projectionist Henry Stanley was in attendance and recalls that Goldsmith included the scene from The Other in which Niles and Ada play the game. Stanley remembers that Goldsmith quipped, "They kept removing my music, saying it was too scary." The attendees laughed, and then Goldsmith added, "I mean, wasn't that the point?" However, Nicholas Brown denies that any musical cues were dropped because of their scariness, stating that certain musical cues were dropped from the film simply because they didn't work. Brown confirms that Robert Mulligan had final cut on The Other, and that even though Tom Tryon sometimes made suggestions, Tryon didn't have the authority to tell Mulligan what to do. So when you watch The Other, you're not watching Tom Tryon's cut, you're not watching 20th Century Fox's cut, you're watching the cut which Robert Mulligan intended for you to see. Now, interestingly, all of the copies of The Other which I have viewed on VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray do not have a 20th Century Fox logo appearing before the film. All of the copies which I've seen immediately begin with the black opening credits reading 20th Century Fox Presents without any logo preceding the credits. Nicholas Brown states that the studio probably cut the Fox logo out of the film after it was syndicated for television, the reason being that a lot of films started playing their own musical scores over the Fox logo, and that the studio was trying to stop filmmakers from doing that. So the Fox logo may have been removed from future prints of The Other as a result of this. Tom Tryon intensely disliked Mulligan's post-production decisions on The Other, stating, "It was not that difficult a film to do if you just decided what the film was going to be. A lot of the horror scenes were cut, and the music was taken out. I was a party to all of this dismemberment and desperation, but there were scenes that were shot that could not be cut, because they were shot in one master shot with nothing to cut to, so you couldn't take a part of it out. So Uta's whole introductory scene, which was a lovely scene between her and the child in the kitchen, which established their relationship, her belief in the boy's relationship with Holland, giving Holland a reality that whole scene went because the audience was just fidgeting. Nicholas Brown remembers that the first preview of the film was held in San Francisco. Brown believes that it was a good preview for what the film was, but he remembers that Tom Tryon freaked out at the preview. Tryon claimed that at one preview, due to the film's violence, "This woman attacked me with her pocketbook. She was hitting me with her pocketbook." Nicholas Brown confirms that an alternate ending was prepared in which we hear voiceover narration by Niles telling Holland that they can't play the game anymore, as if to suggest that Niles will not be committing evil anymore. Brown even remembers cutting together the narration for it, but I've never seen this alternate ending on any versions of the film. I can't find it anywhere on the internet, and I'd be curious to know if it still exists. That being said, the narration would have been superfluous. The other isn't meant to have a happy ending. Niles is supposed to get away with everything. That's the point. That's what makes the ending so scary. The Other was finally released in theaters in May 1972. According to IMDb, there was a premiere in New York, followed by a premiere in LA, and then a nationwide theatrical release. Tom Tryon's friend C. Robert Holloway was living in Hawaii at the time, and recalls that when the film opened in a downtown theater in Honolulu, it lasted only 3 days there. When Holloway called Tryon on the phone to tell him about the underwhelming box office results, Tryon vented his frustrations with how the film had turned out. Holloway assured Tryon that the film wasn't that bad, but Tryon had always been bothered by the film being, in his words, underfinanced. Holloway also reveals that Tryon, in his words, didn't think Mulligan really gave a damn. Interestingly, a user on IMDb going by the name of Anton5s1929 claims to have seen Rod Serling and his wife in attendance at a showing of The Other at the National Theater in Westwood in LA. Asked what he thought of the film, Serling is alleged to have looked up, smiled, and replied, "I loved it. Best movie I've seen in a long time." I asked Don Kranze how well The Other did commercially. Kranze chuckled and responded, "It died." When I asked him what he thought of the film, Kranze said that he thought it was okay, but that he was a little disappointed. He believed that there was not enough of a surprise at the end, adding, "You can't make a mood movie threatening. Give 'em more of a shock." Kranze never worked with Robert Mulligan again, explaining that he only worked on movies whenever somebody gave him a phone call. Kranze's career ended in the 1980s. I asked him why he left the movie industry, and his answer was, "I didn't leave the movie industry. The movie industry left me." Albert Brenner comments that he thought the book and the script of The Other were fuller than the final film. Brenner didn't keep in touch with Mulligan either.
We went into Westwood, the 2 movie theaters there in Westwood, and we saw it. But our favorite scene had been cut, and we were like, oh God. But then we had at least, we got to do it,
Diana Muldaur thought that it was a mistake for The Other to be cut together as a horror film. Certain scenes of hers which gave the audience a deeper glimpse into Alexandra's grief were eliminated from the final cut. Uta Hagen had the same criticism. The book and the script had provided a whole setup to explain the meaning behind the game which Ada and Niles play, but the finished film only provided the audience with a vague indication as to what the game actually is. Letty Ferrer remembers that some friends of Hagen's liked the film, while other friends of hers didn't know what the hell the film was about. Decades later, in an interview with Charlie Rose, Hagen would dismissively describe The Other as a junky little gothic tale.
I remember the first movie I made called The Other, junky little gothic tale. And I remember making these decisions on where I would reveal what about the character.
Right.
I made all those choices. They were in the cutting room. You know, I mean, they were never on screen because they were, at that point, they were showing a bird up in a tree or something.
However, Hagen did keep in touch with Chris and Marty Udvarnoky.
We did some plays in New York, a lot of plays at the HB Studios, which was Uta Hagen's husband's studios. It's called the Herbert Berghoff Studios, and it's in the Village on Bank Street. But so we did numerous plays there. There was an annual Christmas play that we were always in.
Hagen also kept in touch with John Ritter, who must have had fond memories of filming The Other, because decades later he name-dropped Robert Mulligan on an episode of 8 Simple Rules for Dating My Teenage Daughter.
Scout, my daddy told me I could shoot all the blue jays I wanted, but it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. Hennessy, what the hell are you saying?
Gregory Peck in Kill a Mockingbird, directed by Robert Mulligan, one of the greatest. Never mind.
Clarence Crow's grandparents did not allow him to leave Murphy's and attend the premiere for The Other. Crow confesses that when he finally did see the film, he was a little put off by it due to its violence, something which he hadn't been exposed to very much as a child. Crow says that he would have liked to have done more acting, that he'd even been told to keep in touch with people who were influential, but because he was still just a kid, not a professional actor, and because his grandparents were pretty much consumed in day-to-day living and tended to move from place to place, Crow's information for his Hollywood contacts got lost, and he never did get any more acting offers.
Well, we had an opportunity to watch the movie before the actual premiere. They had a large theater that they allowed us to use and invite whoever we wanted, and we pretty much filled this whole theater because we just kind of invited everybody, you know. And so that was really cool. That was really cool to have all our, and that was the first time. We may have seen some cuts here and there of the film, little, you know, partial scenes and so forth, but it was the first time we actually were able to see the movie as a whole, was with, you know, with everybody else. And I don't remember too much of the actual premiere. I do know that we were there in New York. You know, I'm kind of a introverted, I guess you could say, shy kid, and as well as my brother was as well. You know, there was a lot of times on the set that people would ask for autographs, and you know, I thought it was kind of funny, but you know, we obliged. And when the film came out, once in a while somebody would recognize us and ask for an autograph. And there was this one time it was in a theater, and my parents said, "Let's go watch it at this particular theater," and we did. And I guess the theater knew we were coming way ahead of time, and they made a big deal out of it. And there was a lot of people there asking for signatures, and it was like a mini paparazzi type of situation, and taking pictures. And I just remember being a little disturbed about that, you know. Not again, I wasn't angry about I felt flattered and honored, but at the same time, that wasn't my kind of life. And I remember my brother and I just kind of like being a little teary-eyed that, you know, we were put in that kind of situation. A few weeks after we came back from New Jersey, we were asked to fly back out to California and try out for the adventures of Tom Sawyer. You know, I always brag that, you know, the first girl I ever kissed was Jodie Foster. So everybody told us to come back home to New Jersey and continue our childhood, and which is, you know, what we did. But as far as trying to get back into acting, you know, we had the whole portfolio done, and it's a very difficult to get into that kind of profession, unless you actually live in the city. I mean, commuting back and forth just for, you know, an interview or to play a scene, it's hard, you know. And then, you know, trying to work at the same time. There's a lot of talented actors, I believe, that are living in New York or around New York that, you know, are just being waiters and waitresses waiting for that moment. After a while, I just guess it was something we didn't want to pursue all that much. Yeah. And I have a affected me? I don't think it affected me because we did go back to being kids.
Robert Mulligan followed up The Other with the 1974 neo-noir thriller The Nickel Ride. And if you'd like to know more about the making of that great film, check out my in-depth video essay, The Making of the Nickel Ride. Meanwhile, Tom Tryon's literary career seemed as though it was on the rise. Tryon followed up The Other with the best-selling books Harvest Home, Lady, and Crowned Heads. In 1978, NBC turned Harvest Home into a television miniseries, while Billy Wilder adapted the Crowned Heads story Fedora into a feature film. Tom Tryon declined to be involved in either of these productions. By this time, Tom Tryon had already made known his negative opinions about the film of The Other. When Robert Dolan remarked, "You have said that you weren't in love with the movie," Tryon responded, "Oh no, that broke my heart. Jesus, that was very sad. That picture was ruined in the cutting and the casting. The boys were good, Uta was good. The other parts, I think, were carelessly cast in some instances. Not all, but in some instances. And God knows it was badly cut and faultily directed." However, when Dolan asked Tryon if he had ever seriously considered directing The Other himself, Tryon answered, "No, it was too complicated. When I saw what the thing was going to be, I didn't have any pretension about directing this project." In the 1980s, Tryon's writing career and Mulligan's directing career both slowed down. In 1991, Mulligan made a strong comeback with The Man in the Moon, which marked the on-screen debut of 13-year-old Reese Witherspoon and became one of Mulligan's best, most celebrated films, returning him to the rural, nostalgic period piece, the kind of movie which nobody directed better than him. It would also be his final film.
Marie?
What? Will we always talk to each other? Always?
That same year, Tom Tryon died at the age of 65. Although Tryon had managed to get sober from his addiction to drugs and alcohol, he never did come out as an openly gay man. The obituaries said that the cause of Tryon's death was stomach cancer, but a rumor spread across town that Tryon may have actually died of AIDS. This became a sore subject between two of Tryon's friends, Clive Clerk and C. Robert Holloway. In his book, Dangerous Crossing, a memoir, Holloway writes about how he and Clerk were in agreement that Tryon had been HIV positive, and that this had caused Tryon to get stomach cancer. But when Holloway asked if it's possible that stomach cancer can be a result of AIDS, Clerk agitatedly replied, "I'm sure it can, but Tom didn't want his readers or his relatives to know, especially his brother. He was adamant about keeping it quiet."
Спи, малютка, мой прекрасный, баюшки-баю.
I first became aware of The Other as a child growing up in the 1990s, where I used to notice the CBS Fox VHS tape sitting on the shelves of the Schnucks grocery store in Wildwood, Missouri. The cover art always piqued my interest, but my parents wouldn't let me rent it, not even when I pointed out to them that it was rated PG, their reasoning being that it was in the horror section. Flash forward to October 2008. That season, I watched a lot of horror films, and I rented the DVD of The Other through my Blockbuster online service, both because I had remembered wanting to rent the VHS as a child, and because I noticed that it was directed by Robert Mulligan, whose name I vaguely recognized because I'd seen exactly 2 of his films. I couldn't believe that The Other was directed by the same filmmaker who had directed such comparably gentler films as To Kill a Mockingbird and Same Time Next Year. And yet, the more I thought back to how watching To Kill a Mockingbird had always taken me back to growing up as a child, visiting my grandparents' old house in Bridgeton, Missouri on weekends and holidays, the more it occurred to me that the other had made me feel the same way. It just conveyed those feelings on a far darker scale. Because of this, I hoped that someday I might get to meet Robert Mulligan and tell him what an impact the few films of his that I had already seen had already made on me at a young age.
He would be in Jem's room all night. And he would be there when Jem waked up in the morning.
But 2 months later, in December 2008, I read the news that Robert Mulligan had died in Old Lyme, Connecticut, 5 days before Christmas at the age of 83. I remember how crushed I was by the disappointment of knowing that I would never get to meet a legendary filmmaker who I now counted as one of my heroes. A couple years later, in October 2010, the New Jersey Star-Ledger quietly revealed that Chris Udvarnoky had died in New Jersey of kidney disease. He was only 49 years old. Because there weren't any reports about it in the film trades, I wrote up a blog post paying tribute to his performance in The Other, and I also wrote an appreciative piece about the film itself. Somehow, Roger Ebert, who had given The Other a good review back in 1972, read both of my blog pieces and linked to both of them on Twitter. It is Chris Udvarnoky's haunting performance as Niles Perry which carries the film, zapping us unforgettably into the fractured psyche of a warped child, ranging from happy and hyper to frightened and destructive.
Holland did not take the baby. Niles did it.
After I got accepted into film school, I came across a short story written by Mark Twain in the 19th century entitled The Story of the Bad Little Boy Who Didn't Come to Grief. I decided to adapt it into a film, largely because its portrait of the charmed life of an evil miner reminded me a lot of The Other. We shot the film in St. Louis County in 2 glorious days in the autumn of 2012, and I felt that in some ways I was following in Robert Mulligan's footsteps. Looking back, The Other was an important film for me. It changed the way that I looked at suspense thrillers, it influenced my own career as a writer-director, and it remains a fond memory for many of those still alive who worked on it.
I think it's a kind of movie that you either love it or you don't. If you're into thrillers and horror movies, you'll probably like it. Although it doesn't have like the Friday the 13th kind of guts and killing and all that kind of thing. It's done in a more appropriate and civilized way, I think. Although killing a baby is not civilized, it gets the point across without being a whole bunch of blood and guts.
It was pretty thrilling because there was a Robert Mulligan film that we got to be in. What was really cool was, I guess it would have been in 2012, they were doing a retrospective of my dad for his 100th birthday. As I was leaving, someone said, "Oh, you may want to come in." It was like in a couple of months, we're going to do a thing celebrating Robert Mulligan, and we're going to screen The Other. And I went up to the box office to get my little ticket, and I was all excited. I said, I'm in this movie. And they went, "Oh, yeah." And they just gave me a ticket. It was really fun. And I sat in that theater, and sort of seeing it that many years later was astonishing to me. It blew my mind. The cinematography, the sound, the acting, the storytelling, everything about it was, it's scary shit. And it's so sad what happens to these young men. I think I appreciated it even more. And I always wished I could work with Robert Mulligan again after that movie, it's like, because that's like one of the great Hollywood filmmakers. Mm-hmm. And I got to be in one of his movies.
Asked what he thinks of the film today, Clarence Crow comments, "In viewing it, I pick out the parts that I associate with happy things. Some people like getting scared, but it's entertainment. It's an escape, just for a little while, to whatever you enjoy." Thanks to C. Robert Holloway's efforts as co-executor of the Thomas Tryon Literary Estate, the book of The Other was reprinted by New York Review Books Classics. Holloway says that over the years, the estate has received scores of inquiries from producers and agencies about the possibility of a remake. Holloway always directs such inquiries to the lawyers at 20th Century Fox. Of course, now that Disney owns Fox, the film rights have probably gotten even more complicated. Holloway reveals that once somebody even pitched the idea of adapting The Other into an opera, but Holloway thought that this pitch was awful. I do think that it could be possible to make a stirring remake of The Other, since there's some interesting stuff in Tom Tryon's book that still has the potential to be compellingly realized cinematically, most notably the tragic framing device of an adult Niles Perry narrating his life story from a mental asylum. But I'm also biased in that I'm such a big admirer of Robert Mulligan's film that it would infuriate me if any filmmaker deviated from certain things which made his film so masterful. For example, can you imagine The Other without Jerry Goldsmith's ominous musical score? I can't. I'll tell you what I can imagine, however. How chilling it would be if one were to combine the hypnotic final shot of Mulligan's film with Niles' closing thoughts at the end of Tryon's book. So I keep to myself. Mostly I like to watch the Shadow Hills buses end their route at the corner and turn around.
Niles, wash up now. Time for lunch.
Oh yes, they took the streetcars off years ago. But other than that, nothing much has changed. It's still the end of the line. Thanks for watching.